So I'm in about page 11 here, sort of trying to think through what's going on in the first half of the dialogue. And what so far Socrates has done is basically made a claim that the philosopher welcomes death because it's only in death that the philosopher gets what they really want, which is truth, real knowledge. But Socrates has a couple of men who he's talking with who are pretty acute, and although they're trying to be delicate in their skepticism, considering the circumstances. Their skepticism about the immortality of the soul, they, because they don't want to be rude, because Socrates is going to die that day, so it may be in bad taste to challenge it, but Socrates is continually encouraging them, right? To just, okay, what are your objections? I know that everything I've said isn't obviously true, so feel free, don't hold back. So at the top of page 11, Cebes says, after Socrates has given his explanation of why the philosopher welcomes death, he says, I agree, Socrates, in the greater part of what you say. But in what concerns the soul, men are apt to be incredulous. They fear that when she has left the body, her place may be nowhere, and that on the very day of death, she may perish and come to an end. Immediately on her release from the body, issuing forth dispersed like smoke or air, and in her flight vanishing away into nothingness. If she could only be collected into herself after she has obtained release from the evils of which you are speaking, there would be good reason to hope, Socrates, that what you say is true. But surely it requires a great deal of argument and many proofs to show that when the man is dead, his soul yet exists and has any force or intelligence. I mean, this is exactly the right question, I think. That is, Cebes is basically saying, well, okay, you have defined death as the separation of soul and body. And we'll take that as granted. Death is a separation of soul and body. And that is really the very difficult task that Socrates has got to take up. Yes, okay, well, sure, death is the separation of soul and body, but it's not obvious at all that the soul continues its existence after this separation. I mean, it's clear that the body disintegrates and dies. Why would we believe that the soul doesn't also disperse, disintegrate, and die? I mean, if body and soul can be thought of as two different things, what evidence do we have that the soul continues to have being, to have an existence after its separation from the body? So, in a way, everything up to now has been fun and games. Socrates' painting is a wonderful picture of how heroic the philosopher is, and how the philosopher should welcome death because true knowledge comes after death and only after death, because the soul has to be liberated from the body, and the philosopher has practiced his whole life for this. Cebes asks a very cogent question. What reason do we have to believe that the soul continues at all? And that brings us to Socrates' first proofs or attempts to prove the immortality of the soul proper. I mean, the actual question. I mean, his first argument is a very interesting argument about opposites and how everything comes from its opposite. It's a very interesting. The first time you read it, it may be laughable, right? That this could be in any way a proof for the immortality of the soul. But take a look at it and give it some give it some room. But basically, the idea is that the dead come from the living, which is certainly true. But if being alive and being dead are opposite, then if the general rule that everything comes from its opposite is true, then which would obviously mean something like a theory of reincarnation or something. That is definitely worth thinking about, but that's his first argument. And his second argument is the so-called the argument from affinity. And that, again, returns us to the idea of the forms. Oh, yes, there's the argument from Recollection. If all knowledge is recollection, it's recollection of things we learned before we were born. And you can see where that leads. There's kind of a reference to other dialogues where Socrates talks about the idea of knowledge as recollection. But the argument from affinity is kind of I think maybe one of his strongest arguments, actually, and we'll return to it. The argument of affinity goes back to this idea of the absolute. I mean, one of the things that Socrates would always say is that these things here are all individual things. But this here, the beautiful itself, the form of beauty, the essence of beauty, is not an individual thing in the same sense. It is an idea. It is a concept. The form of the beautiful you can look at a painting by Monet. You can actually listen to a symphony by Mozart. But the beautiful that they contain is something that can only be grasped by the mind, not the senses. It is a pure idea. Let's think about that. He doesn't mean an idea in the sense of a mental content. He means a kind of being, kind of like a concept. Think of something in mathematics. Think of something really familiar like the Pythagorean Theorem. Pythagorean Theorem is a proposition about the relationship between the different sides of a right triangle. Right? It is a theorem that, in fact, Socrates knew well, Plato knew well. I'm sure they knew how to prove it. So think of something like the Pythagorean Theorem, which is something that Plato knew about, Socrates knew about, and then think of the building in Athens, the Parthenon. I think it's the Parthenon, right? Yeah, on the Acropolis, the famous temple. That's another thing that they knew. It was a fairly new building in their time, I believe. Now, the Pythagorean Theorem is something that they knew and something that you knew, that you know. The Parthenon is a place that they could go look at and see, and it's a place that we could go look at if we went to Athens. Let me ask you this question. has the Pythagorean theorem changed at all since their time? Or when you're thinking of the Pythagorean theorem, are you thinking of something that is exactly the same as what they were thinking of, or something different? And then think of the Parthenon. You can go see it. It is arguably the same building. It is the same building. Has it changed since their time? Well, of course it has. In the past 2,500 years, it's changed a lot. It's still standing, barely, but boy, has it changed. Whereas the Pythagorean theorem, which has no physical presence, is a purely intellectual thing, is a concept or an idea. It's arguable that that hasn't changed in 2,500 years, because those kind of things don't change, because they're not in time. They're not subject to decay. They are eternal things. I say the truths of logic, mathematics, the pure concepts like that. Or just think of something like even simpler, a mathematical concept like the very idea of a right triangle. Has that changed since the time of the Greeks? When you conceive of a right triangle, are you not conceiving of exactly the same thing that Euclid or Plato or Socrates did all those years ago? Whereas physical things, individual physical things like the Parthenon, well, they change, they decay, and eventually go out of existence. Okay, so what does this have to do with his argument for the immortality of the soul? Well, the soul is what allows us to know those absolutes, right? The soul is what contains intellect, which allows us to grasp pure concepts. So the idea is that those pure concepts, he would argue the forms of beauty, justice, the form of equality, the form of everything, along with the concepts of mathematics, are eternal, that they don't change. That it would make no sense to say that the Pythagorean theorem was destroyed. It would make no sense to say, for Socrates, that the form of absolute justice decayed or something. No, those are the kind of things that physical things change and physical things decay, but purely intellectual things are eternal. Well, if the soul is what allows us to know these eternal things, it must be like them, or at least enough like them to put us in touch with them. And there you see a certain argument for the immortality of the soul, in the sense that the soul is intellect. If the soul is able to grasp these eternal realities, the soul itself must be enough like them to grasp them. And if it's enough like them to grasp them, then it too is eternal. And so we should have no fear, he says, that somehow that the soul will disperse and die after its separation from the body, any more than we should have a fear that the concept of a right triangle or the form of justice or the notion of the Pythagorean theorem will disperse and die. It's an interesting argument. I think it happens to be the strongest argument in the whole of the dialogue for the immortality of the soul. I think there are enormous questions and difficulties, but Socrates himself would be the first one to admit that. But a very interesting and important argument.